Welcome to History at Age 9, a program about naval history from the Hampton Roads Naval Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, home of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Naval Station Norfolk faces the historic harbor of Hampton Roads. It is the largest military installation in the world, but 10 years before construction began on the base, much of the land and the harbor that the base is located on was the site of the Jamestown Exposition of 1907, a world fair that commemorated the 300th anniversary of the settlement of Jamestown by the English, and it was also the departing and returning point of the battle fleet of the United States Navy, which later became known as the Great White Fleet, due to the ships being painted white. The story of these two events are closely tied to the origins of Naval Station Norfolk and the development of America becoming a world power in the early 20th century. I would like you to take a moment to think about what your life as a sailor is like today. What are some of the jobs that you perform on ships today? What is the dirtiest job that you can think of that are done on ships today? Let's consider these questions as we step back in time more than 100 years ago and examine what was happening in the world and with the U.S. Navy at that time. I'm Catherine Renfrew, and this is Voyage of a Lifetime, The Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, Episode 1, The Beginning. The surrender of Santiago by the Spanish to the Americans on August 12, 1898, and the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10th of that same year gave the U.S. a new role as a world power. The U.S. acquired their first overseas colonies, Spain's former colonies Guam, the Philippine Islands, and Puerto Rico, and they gained sovereignty over Cuba. This event and others leading up to the beginning of the 20th century marked a change on how Americans felt about themselves as a country. The aftermath of the Civil War, westward expansion, the Industrial Revolution, and the Spanish-American War all ushered in a new sense of patriotism. Americans were confident and optimistic. However, these same events created social unrest that marred America's newfound optimism. Foreign relations between Japan and the United States was marked by increasing tension. Each country now had territory and interest in Asia that they were concerned about, and U.S. treatment of Japanese immigrants and competition for economic and commercial opportunities in China also heightened tensions. In addition, the Russo-Japanese War between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan from 1904 to 1905 played a major role in tensions. Japan was the victor, and the outcome changed the balance of power in Asia, with Japan becoming a major naval power. But for the most part, though, the victory in the Spanish-American War revealed a resurgence of American naval strength. By the time Roosevelt was inaugurated, there was a renewed affection for the U.S. Navy by the American people. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th president and the youngest at age 42 to serve after President McKinley was assassinated in September of that year. As president, he pursued his naval program with steely determination. He believed the most important policy of his presidency was to upgrade and expand the U.S. Navy. Roosevelt's love of the Navy, his strategies and policies were tremendously influenced by the officer and historian Alfred Thayer Mahan. He wrote over 20 books on naval history and sea power, but the most important volumes were The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, and The Influence of Sea Power Upon the French Revolution and Empire, 1793 to 1812, which won immediate recognition both abroad and at home. It has been said that Mahan was the most important American strategist of the 19th century, and today is recognized as the major prophet of sea power. Mahan believed that having a strong presence on the seas is one of the main reasons that help a country win wars and become an influential world power. He encouraged the U.S. to expand its naval power and project its power globally. With this, the U.S. would increase trade and prosperity and protect American business interests. President Roosevelt would put Mahan's theory into practice. At the close of the Jamestown Exposition in November 1907, the United States battle fleet, which had been anchored in the harbor during the exposition, returned to sea for battleship maneuvers and to home shipyards in preparation for their next assignment. One near and dear to President Theodore Roosevelt, supposedly a practice cruise to the Pacific. Roosevelt's vision and reasoning to send the new battle fleet around the world was multifaceted. Number one, the U.S. was keeping an eye on Japan. Roosevelt wanted to send a strong but peaceful message to Japan and other nations that the U.S. Navy could now move from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific and protect its interests anywhere around the globe. Number two, it was to test the strength and weaknesses of the ships, equipment, and sailors. It was imperative to take measure of the fleet while at peace instead of while the U.S. might be at war. The president also wanted to find out what condition the fleet would be in after such a transit. As he stated before the fleet's departure, "I want all failures, blunders, and shortcomings to be made apparent in time of peace and not in time of war." Number three, Roosevelt thought that the voyage would assure the American people of the U.S. Navy's stability, preparedness, and strength. And number four, Roosevelt also believed that if the cruise were successful, he would receive additional appropriations for more battleships that would help further achieve his naval policies. By the 1890s, the old wooden fleet had gradually faded away, and modernization of the Navy had begun. The battleships assigned to the U.S. battle fleet represented the new Navy, with steel hulls, steam power, and long-range rifled guns. In addition, at the beginning of the 20th century, the organization of the battle fleet underwent a revolutionary change. For the first time, the ships of the U.S. Navy were concentrated in a few heavy units rather than spread out in small squadrons all over the face of the earth. Between 1891 and 1905, approximately 25 new battleships were built. All the vessels were commissioned after the Spanish-American War. There were 16 battleships included in the fleet, and they were mainly painted white except for the gilded scrollwork on their bows, with their superstructure painted a buff color. The fleet consisted of 2 squadrons of battleships. Each squadron had 2 divisions with 4 battleships each. The battleships were accompanied during the first leg of their voyage by a torpedo flotilla of 6 early destroyers as well as by several auxiliary ships. Let's go over a few battleship facts. Number 1, ships were coal-burning. They held approximately 2,000 tons of coal and burned 10 tons of coal per hour and produced very dense smoke and tons of ash. Number 2, ships had electricity, which was run by that coal. Number 3, ships were able to make their own water. 1 ton of coal created 7 tons of water. 4, the size of a battleship crew was approximately 827 officers and men. 5, ships steamed at various rates from 8 to 13 knots, but the actual transit time was made at the average rate of 10 knots per hour. Number 6, when in formation, they steamed behind each other at precisely 400-yard intervals. Number 7, the ships all had wireless communications. 28 units of telegraph and telephone were installed before the fleet left Hampton Roads. And finally, number 8, the ships ranged in size from about 10,000 to 16,000 tons. By December 9, 1907, all the battleships returned to Hampton Roads. It was no surprise that President Roosevelt returned to the site of the Jamestown Exposition to send off the Atlantic Fleet on their goodwill journey around the world. On the morning of December 16th, the morning colors ceremony were conducted and the ships were full dress to pay tribute to President Roosevelt. A little after 8 a.m., the presidential yacht, the Mayflower, came into sight. All 16 battleships executed a simultaneous 21-gun salute. As the Mayflower continued into the harbor, a second gun salute from Fort Monroe was rendered. The yacht then proceeded to sail through in between the columns of the 1st and 2nd squadrons. Of course, the scene was spectacular. There were bands playing, sailors manned the rails, and Marine detachments paraded. As the Mayflower passed through the two squadrons, Roosevelt was so moved by the scene that he said to the Secretary of the Navy, "Did you ever see such a fleet? Isn't it magnificent? Aren't we all feel proud?" As was the custom, Admiral Robley D. Evans, the fleet commander, and other officers boarded the Mayflower for a meeting with the President. Shortly after the meeting, the Mayflower headed out preceding the battleships who were preparing to depart. The Mayflower anchored just outside the Chesapeake Bay so Roosevelt could watch the fleet as they departed. At 10 o'clock a.m., all 16 battleships moved into line, forming a long, stately column flanked by the auxiliary ships as they left Hampton Roads and moved out toward the open sea. Once again, there was a 21-gun salute as they were passing the Mayflower. One can assume that Admiral Evans was extremely proud of his fleet. Earlier in the day, he had stated that his ships were ready at the drop of a hat for a feast, a frolic, or a fight. The journey to the Pacific had begun. On the first day out at sea, Admiral Evans revealed to the officers and men of the fleet Roosevelt's plan for the voyage, which had previously not been shared with anyone except for a few of the highest-ranking naval officials. As far as everyone knew, they were just going on training exercises from the east to the west coast, a practice cruise to the Pacific. Evans laid out the plan. Following a brief stay on the west coast, the fleet would return home via the Pacific through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean and then to the Atlantic. In short, they would be steaming around the globe. The next day, when the announcement became common knowledge, countries throughout the world offered invitations for the fleet to visit their ports. The voyage of the Great White Fleet would take 14 months, and the sailors would travel 45,000 miles and make 20 port calls on 6 different continents. In short, they would be steaming around the globe. I'm Catherine Renfrew, and this is Voyage of a Lifetime, The Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, Episode 2, To the Pacific. On December 23rd, the fleet arrived at their first port, the Port of Spain in Trinidad, a small island off the coast of Venezuela. This first stop left a lot to be desired. Unfortunately, the arrival of the fleet coincided with the opening of the horse racing season, and they received a tepid, if not indifferent, reception. The sailors were not very happy. According to one of the sailors, when they arrived, there were no people around, and almost everything was closed up. Just one building was open that had any beer in it. By the time we made it to shore, the stuff was hot as hell. It was just like drinking boiler water. Another commented that there wasn't much to do except look at the flowers and visit a leper colony. The cruise celebrated Christmas with swimming and other activities. The officers of USS Minnesota gave a Christmas celebration aboard their ship to the other officers. Men of the Vermont sailed around singing songs to every ship. They steamed on toward Rio de Janeiro for their next port of call. Just 3 days after the fleet left Hampton Roads, every ship received a wireless message from King Neptune. The message was a warning to be ready to receive the ruler of the deep on crossing the equator. The traditional crossing the line ceremonies were going to be unpleasant for the sailors who had not crossed before, but even more so for those who did not show up. On January 3, 1908, the fleet began crossing the equator. More than 12,000 sailors underwent initiation. They were shaved with an oversized razor, took a long descent into a pool of water, they had a ritual bath, and I'm sure unwillingly participated in other activities. They were pollywogs no more, but shellbacks inducted into the Order of the Deep. The fleet arrived in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, on January 12, 1908. They received their first mail call, which was the highlight of every sailor's day. One sailor remembered that there was one man aboard the USS Connecticut who couldn't read. He said whenever this fellow got mail, he'd have someone read his letters to him, and he'd make whoever was doing it stick cotton in his ears so he wouldn't be able to hear what he was reading. He thought he could keep his privacy that way. Unlike Trinidad, the sailors' visit to Rio was anything but boring. The visit included official luncheons and parties for the officers and general liberty for the crews. Regrettably, the sailors became engaged in a fight at one of the more spirited bars on their first night in town. It was a disaster, to say the least. Two local longshoremen were arguing and threw a beer bottle at the other, but missed and hit a sailor from the Louisiana. Of course, you can imagine what happened next. Sailors came to the aid of their comrades, and the longshoremen did the same. All heck broke out. When the shore patrol and police finally arrived, the fight had flowed into the street, where they witnessed the two groups throwing bricks and rocks at each other. Order was restored, and the sailors were escorted back to their ships. The confrontation came close to breaking the goodwill ties between the U.S. Navy and Brazil. The following day, an investigation determined that it was the civilians' fault. Therefore, the Brazilian officials forgave the sailors. To improve relations, officials publicly invited all the sailors to continue to enjoy their hospitality. There were no further incidents, and everyone had a great time. Now, while in Rio, Admiral Evans had an attack of gout, which he continued to suffer with throughout the cruise. Eventually, this illness would be to blame for him being relieved of command. The fleet left Rio and headed toward the Strait of Magellan, near the southern tip of South America toward the Pacific. The strait is a natural mountain-rimmed and very narrow passage in southern Chile that separates the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Unpredictable winds and currents make it difficult to traverse. The fleet had no choice but to take that course since the Panama Canal had not been completed at that time. In a line 3 miles long, the battleships thread their way through the perilous Strait of Magellan. Newspaper headlines back home in the United States printed sensational stories predicting shipwrecks and said our boys are in terrible danger. They all knew that the straits were all inhabited by cannibals. It was windy and foggy, but a Chilean cruiser came to their aid and guided the fleet through the straits without any issues whatsoever. The fleet made a brief stop in Punta Arenas, Chile. Arriving in the South Pacific, they followed a naval parade through the harbor of Valparaiso, Chile, and steamed on towards Peru. The fleet reached Callao, located just north of Lima, the capital, on February the 20th. The Peruvians welcomed the American sailors with open arms, and the American sailors eagerly accepted their hospitality. 9 days of celebrations that included commemorations of George Washington's birthday. Peruvian composer Cesar Panizo composed a special dance piece entitled The White Squadron. A small tugboat rode around the anchored ships, its passengers performing Cornell football cheers and songs for the crews, and the sailors were entertained by bullfights in Lima. The next stop was a month-long stay in Magdalena Bay, Mexico, where arrangements had been made with the Mexican government that allowed the Americans to hold gunnery exercises, drills, and sports. Now, while the fleet was in Mexico, California's coastal cities were trying everything in their power to get the fleet to visit their ports. They succeeded. The fleet visited many ports along the coast of California, including San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, Monterey, and San Francisco. When the fleet pulled into San Diego on April 14, 1908, the sailors were greeted by thousands of enthusiastic residents as the great ships anchored off the Hotel del Coronado. Small boats of all descriptions surrounded the warships, and sailors were pelted with blossoms by flower committees and filled to capacity with free lemonade by fruit committees. For the next 4 days, San Diego celebrated, and the sailors were given the royal treatment that ended only with the fleet's departure for Los Angeles on April 18th. It is said by historians that if the fleet had not stopped to visit San Diego at that time, San Diego might not have become the Navy town that it is today. Like San Diego, when the fleet arrived in San Francisco on May 6th, the hills surrounding the city by the bay were packed with thousands of greeters, many brought in by special trains from outlying communities. While the men were enjoying the hospitality of San Franciscans, some elements of the fleet traveled north to Washington under the command of Rear Admiral C.M. Thomas. Stops included Seattle, Bellingham, and Tacoma. The citizens of Seattle gave each ship a baby bear. It was common at that time for local officials to give animals to visiting ships. There were cats and dogs on all the ships, but more unusual and exotic animals were often adopted as mascots. The mighty battleships of the U.S. fleet received everything from kangaroos to eagles to bears. Some animals didn't work out so well. For example, monkeys given to sailors on one of the ships escaped their enclosures and made a home among the smokestacks, biting anyone who tried to catch them. One sailor said, "We keep adding a little to our host of pets in most every port, and the Connecticut begins to look more like a menagerie than a warship. Our list now stands as follows: 6 dogs, all breeds about the same number of cats, a pig, parrots, and a monkey from Trinidad, a black bear from Seattle, a kangaroo, an eagle, 2 native opossums, and more parrots from Sydney. The electricians have a pair of white rats from Los Angeles, 2 Angora goats from Punta Arenas, and 1 from Santa Barbara, and a raccoon from Rio." The ships received needed repairs at Navy yards on the West Coast like Puget Sound. While in port at San Francisco, Evans' health continued to worsen, and command of the fleet passed to Rear Admiral Charles Sperry. Also, the squadrons were slightly rearranged, bringing the newest and best ships in the fleet up to the first squadron. Glacier was detached and later became the supply ship of the Pacific Fleet. At this time also, USS Maine and Alabama were replaced by USS Nebraska and USS Wisconsin due to their high coal consumption. The fleet's visit up and down the West Coast lasted almost 3 months. That part of the cruise appeared to be a continuous party with everyone, civilians and sailors, celebrating the fleet. On July 7th, the fleet regrouped, and Rear Admiral Sperry, Admiral Evans' replacement, took the fleet to sea again and continued its journey across the Pacific. The fleet continued their journey steaming across the Pacific toward Hawaii. The 3rd Division, commanded by Rear Admiral William H. Emery, broke from the rest of the fleet and headed southeast toward the island of Maui for coaling. A small party had the honor of meeting the former Queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, at her home in Lahaina. Even though the Queen had been deposed and exiled by the U.S. government in 1893, she was still gracious enough to greet the sailors. The rest of the fleet arrived in Honolulu on July 16th. The sailors were given liberty and had a very nice time. Their 6-day stop consisted of luau's, sailing regattas, and plenty of beach time. Liberty was only a small part of a sailor's life. What was the rest of their life like? I'm Captain Renfrew, and this is Voyage of a Lifetime, The Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, Episode 3, Across the Pacific. Early century sailors lived a life that was rugged and frequently dangerous, a life that was transformed even more by the new technologies of the ships on which they served, and hardships of weather and the ocean. Accidents were not at all uncommon, and the sailors basically existed in a physically claustrophobic world. They endured these hardships and enjoyed brief moments of fun whenever possible. The normal day-to-day tasks kept sailors busy while underway. Non-stop rounds of cleaning, chores, watches, and drills were the norm. Let's take a look at some facts of the sailors of the early 20th century. Sailors still slept in hammocks. Sailors still holystoned, or you can call it swab the decks. Provisions and messing arrangements changed due to ship refrigeration, which resulted in a general mess instead of a rotating mess. The Navy rations law in 1902 passed, making the food on ship more palpable. Ratings changed as the skills needed evolved. Organized sports and a system of ship libraries were established. Frequent stops for coaling were part of everyday life, whereas before on a sailing ship, as long as you had potable water and your food held out, the ship could remain at sea. Life at sea for the sailors who worked above deck did not have it so bad though, compared to the jobs of the coal passers, who worked in the fire room below decks. At a minimum, the sailors' topside had the advantage of sunlight and breezes. Below decks, the engineer's world was dominated by intense heat and coal dust. One sailor, Charles Herget, commented that after working with the coal, he decided that hell can't be any worse than this. All was not bad though. After hours, there was still time for other diversions for those not on watch. Aboard the ships were pianos and phonographs, various games, plenty of playing cards, and handball and billiard equipment. There were also silent movies. One sailor on USS Connecticut said they had one movie they showed us about 50 times. It was called The Perils of Pauline. It was a film series. They might show number 9 one day and then show number 47 the next, but we enjoyed it anyway. She, meaning Pauline, was always in some kind of fix, getting thrown off cliff and things like that. The extracurricular activities enjoyed by the sailors was definitely earned. After Hawaii, the fleet then streamed to New Zealand, arriving on August the 9th. Once again, the men were warmly received by the civilians as they entered Auckland's port. The men were entertained with party after party. The New Zealanders even invited Admiral Sperry and his staff to observe the tribal ceremonies at a Maori village. The next stop was Australia. When they arrived in Sydney on August the 20th, they were greeted by more than 250,000 people who had supposedly stayed up all night so as not to miss the ships when they arrived. The Australians welcomed the fleet with great acclaim and cheer. The fleet made stops in Sydney, Melbourne, and Albany. Nothing was too good for the sailors. They were given the key to the city of Melbourne, and their kindness made such a good impression that many sailors were disinclined to leave when the ships got underway. In fact, the U.S. Navy men were very popular with the local females, and many relationships bloomed during their visit. This created an issue so much that USS Kansas stayed behind to round up latecomers after the rest of the fleet had sailed off to its next destination. Even that wasn't sufficient to bring in everybody. More than 100 of the Americans deserted and stayed behind with their newfound companions. The fleet steamed north, headed for the Philippines. They arrived on October the 2nd. The Liberty was not allowed due to a cholera epidemic. However, a few officers were allowed on land, but they could not stay overnight and had to bring their own drinking water and not eat any of the food. On October the 10th, the fleet departed for Japan. Now, while en route in the South China Sea, they ran into a severe typhoon. Now, a typhoon is a tropical cyclone that occurs in the South Pacific or Indian Ocean, and it was reported that this typhoon was the worst in 40 years. According to one sailor, the typhoon happened right off Mimosa. All you could see when a ship was in trough was the trunk of its mast above the wave tops. That was all you could see of an entire battleship. Then our turn would come to go into a trough, and we couldn't see anything for a while. The storm lasted almost 2 days. Finally, on October 13th, the storm subsided. Admiral Sperry gathered the scattered ships and assessed the damage. USS Kearsarge lost its foremast and wireless antenna. Wisconsin, Illinois, New Jersey, and Virginia had their whaleboats smashed and washed away. The Virginia also suffered flooding from her destroyed ventilator. Railings were twisted and broken, portholes shattered, and wireless aerials destroyed. Apparently, the fleet was fairly lucky. The storm killed some 800 people in northern Luzon in the Philippines and wiped out an estimated 2,700 people in Amoy, China. The fleet recovered and headed toward Japan, the most crucial visit in terms of diplomacy. But before reaching Yokohama on October 18th, Admiral Perry distributed a directive concerning liberty in Japan. In it, he stated, only first-class men, whose records showed no evidence of previous indulgence in intoxicating liquor, would be allowed ashore. The directive went on to state that the men will be made to understand that this, though an entertainment, is a matter of military duty, and all sailors should conduct themselves accordingly. When the ships arrived the next day, they were escorted into the bay by 3 Japanese destroyers. On shore, they were greeted by singing schoolchildren that had been taught to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, Hail Columbia, and other patriotic American songs. Monday, October 19th, was declared American Day in Tokyo. The government and people of Tokyo and Yokohama had been preparing for the fleet's visit for months and went to extreme lengths to ensure the visit went well. All the citizens had hung Japanese and American flags, lanterns, and other decorations on their houses. During the visit, no incidents occurred. The fleet's visit had the desired result. It generated goodwill between both countries and eased tensions that might otherwise have led to open conflict. Admiral Sperry reported to President Roosevelt that it had been profoundly successful and beneficent in effect. President Roosevelt was delighted. My policy of constant friendliness and courtesy toward Japan, he wrote, coupled with sending the fleet around the world, has borne good results. In fact, on November 30th, 1908, the Root-Takagi Agreement was signed. It was an accord between the U.S. and Japan that averted a move toward possible war. It mutually acknowledged certain international policies and spheres of influence in the Pacific, and pledged mutual support and respect for the open-door policy in China. Leaving Japan, half the fleet steamed back to Manila for a target practice, while the other 8 ships set course for the Formosa Straits and the Chinese island of Amoy. The Peking government was prepared to welcome 16 battleships, but when only 8 ships arrived, the local officials were very disappointed and embarrassed. The slight was due to operational requirements and unintentional on the fleet's part, but it created a slight issue where the Chinese believed they had lost face. However, Peking saved face by reporting in the Chinese Imperial Court newspaper that the rest of the fleet was lost in a typhoon, which was a believable lie at the time. Similar to the Philippines, a dangerous epidemic plagued Amoy. In order to keep the sailors safe, China had built a special entertainment center or temporary city for the officers and men of the Atlantic Fleet. It had to be rebuilt after being destroyed by the typhoon. All of the food and drink was brought in from Shanghai, along with rickshaws, mandarin chairs, horses, and wagons. The American fleet honored the Dowager Empress of the country. She reciprocated by giving presents of cloisonné china to the ship's crews. Each officer received a vase, and each enlisted man got a teacup. Many of the sailors were introduced to shark fin soup, an Asian delicacy, and they also witnessed the horrific beheading of a Chinese citizen. Concluding its call on Amoy, the 8 ships steamed back to Manila to join the rest of the fleet on maneuvers. On December 1st, 1908, the entire fleet departed the Philippines and headed toward home. From the Philippines, the entire fleet sailed into the Indian Ocean, making a port call at Colombo, Ceylon, which is now modern-day Sri Lanka, which lies off the southeastern coast of India. Once again, they enjoyed the country's hospitality. Many sailors enjoyed riding elephants, while others rode on the special train that carried them to the capital city of Kandy, high up in the mountains. The fleet celebrated the Christmas of 1908 underway, crossing the Indian Ocean en route to the Arabian Sea. The ships were decorated with palms, colored streamers, coconuts, and other fruit. A holiday routine was set throughout the ships, and sailors enjoyed a number of competitions, including potato races, three-legged races, and sack races. They even bobbed for oranges and perhaps dreamt of being home. I'm Catherine Renfrew, and this is Voyage of a Lifetime, The Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, Episode 4, The Voyage Home. After Ceylon, the fleet steamed toward the Mediterranean, single file through the Suez Canal. The canal which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. It was the first canal that directly linked the two. They stopped at Port Said, Egypt, to take on coal and then split into several parties, visiting ports along the Mediterranean coast. USS Alabama and Maine visited Egypt. On December 28, 1908, a massive earthquake and tsunami struck Messina, Italy. Admiral Sperry received word of the quake, and the Navy's Goodwill cruise became a reality. Sperry ordered the supply ship Cologa, carrying hundreds of tons of food, the tender Yankton with 6 Navy surgeons from the battleships and medical supplies, followed by USS Connecticut and Illinois. By the time the sailors arrived, they had the sober task of recovering bodies. They helped recover the bodies of U.S. Consul Arthur S. Cheney and his wife Laura from beneath the ruins. Some of the Mediterranean ports of call included Algiers, Tripoli, Naples, Marseille, Athens, Beirut, and Malta. Regrouping once again, the fleet made a final port call at Gibraltar and then steamed out into the Atlantic on February the 6th, headed for Hampton Roads. The ship's bands playing Home Sweet Home on this last leg of the voyage. The fleet arrived home on a rainy day on February the 22nd and was met by Roosevelt aboard Mayflower and cheering crowds ashore. The bands were playing Strike Up the Band, followed by the slower, more sentimental song, There's No Place Like Home. Of course, there was a 21-gun salute, which was met with enthusiastic applause. A sailor remembered the homecoming. We hit Hampton Roads on Washington's birthday and it was raining, but by golly, we celebrated with hardtack and sow belly dinner that day. Later, all the deckhands had to go to Washington and parade in the snow for President-elect Howard Taft. With only 2 weeks left in the White House, the return of the fleet and the success of its mission prompted Roosevelt to declare later that the cruise was the most important service that I rendered for peace. And he said in a speech to Admiral Sperry and his men, "In addition, you, the officers and men of this formidable fighting force, have shown yourselves the best of all possible ambassadors and heralds of peace. We welcome you home to the country whose good repute among nations has been raised by what you have done." Now, the cruise had many significant results, both diplomatically for the nation and technically for the U.S. Navy. On the diplomatic side, the cruise fulfilled our country's desire to be recognized as a world power. Our relations with the countries visited were either improved or established in a positive way. The most important improvement of relations was with Japan, the main diplomatic target from the beginning. The visit by the fleet provided the main thrust behind the Route Takahira Agreement that went into effect shortly after the fleet's return. According to this treaty, the United States and Japan agreed to maintain the status quo in the Pacific and to respect each other's possessions there. Also, both nations consented to respect the open door policy in China and the independence and territorial integrity of that country. One of the main successes of the Great White Fleet was that it brought widespread public awareness and education of and appreciation for the U.S. Navy, not only in the U.S., but abroad. Americans had followed the progress of the Great White Fleet throughout its journey in the newspapers, and for the most part, the sailors or crew acted as American diplomats having personal contact with the host countries and its people. In his report for 1909, the Secretary of the Navy stated that the cruise increased enlistments and enabled the Bureau of Navigation to recruit the enlisted force to practically its full strength. A pleasing development in a period when few American boys thought seriously of joining the Navy. Moreover, the Secretary was able to report there has been a gratifying decrease in the percentage of desertions, which has dropped from 9 to 5.5% during the past year. The crews also provided on-the-job training for the sailors operationally, technically, and diplomatically. The crews reinforced their pride in service and country. They had been the ambassadors of goodwill and the vehicles through which others perceived and judged America and the Navy. But even more concretely, the sailors saw their individual roles and the role of the Great White Fleet as providing the muscle behind U.S. foreign policy. The crew learned to deal with fuel shortages and consumption, engineering reliability, and ship handling, not to mention their daily gunnery exercise and routine life aboard the steel battleships. They learned how to get the greatest economy out of their engines, the most mileage per ton of coal. Because they had no Navy yards handy, they learned that to a great degree, they could maintain their ships themselves. They learned to place their ships accurately on station during tactical drills and battle exercises, and to keep them there. Experience gained by the crews led to improvements in formation steaming, coal economy, and morale. Gunnery exercises doubled the fleet's accuracy. It highlighted the strength and weaknesses of the Navy as well. Though the peacetime crews did not test the performance of the battleships while in combat, the successful return to Hampton Roads proved the fleet's ability to cruise substantial distances without major mechanical problems. The experience also helped the Navy identify certain needed improvements to ship design. Now, the negatives included a reliance on foreign colliers and the need for coaling stations and auxiliary ships for coaling and resupply. There were various technical defects in the ship design. There was a need for greater size and displacement of ships. Shipboard habitability wasn't adequate, and ventilation had to be improved. Hull casement shutters couldn't keep the water out in rough seas. Rapid fire guns placed close to the waterline could not be used effectively, since spray and water shipping into the gun ports were distracting to the crews. And the lofty upper works of the ships were found to be comfortable for peacetime conditions, but what would be shell exploders during wartime? The voyage brought to light various technical defects. In addition, the old-style military mast and fighting tops were replaced by new cage masks with fire control tops. Top-heavy bridges and chart houses were removed and replaced by open bridges. Lightweight torpedo defense guns gave way to more powerful pieces, and new fire control gear is fitted out on the ships. Sperry also recommended that the ships of the Navy would have their coloration changed from white to gray, something naval officers had been recommending for years. It was felt that Navy ships should not be in holiday colors going into battle. In conclusion, the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, which later became known as the Great White Fleet, consisting of 15,000 sailors and Marines, covered 43,000 nautical miles on their trip around the globe. The fleet's journey started on December 16, 1907 in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and ended 14 months later on February 22, 1909, when they returned to Hampton Roads, Virginia. The sailors made 20 port calls on 6 different continents and experienced things that they never could have imagined, some lighthearted and fun, while others were somber and sobering. In the words of one sailor, Frank B. Lesher, an electrician on USS Virginia, "It all seems a sort of a dream to me now that it is over with, but nevertheless, the cold fact remains that I have been to Cairo and have stood upon the Sahara Desert while the pyramids built over 40 centuries ago gaze down upon me." Whatever the significance of the world cruise for U.S. international relations, and whatever its significance for the Navy as an institution, the young sailors that joined the Navy had literally seen the world. It was truly the voyage of a lifetime.